Why are millennials leaving their faith? We're talking about that today on the Church Revitalization Podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the Church Revitalization Podcast, brought to you by the Malphurs Group team, where each week we tackle important, actionable topics to help churches thrive. And now, here's your hosts, Scott Ball and AJ Matthew.
Welcome to the Church Revitalization Podcast. My name is Scott Ball. I am joined by my friend and co-host, AJ Matthew. AJ, welcome back from being across the pond.
Across the pond. Oh, that's so fun to say, isn't it? For we Americans, I suppose.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mentioned
thanks.
this last week's when I was on my own that you were in Germany, and that the Malphurs Group is a nonprofit ministry, and we serve churches around the globe. Any church that we work with or partner with in any way outside of North America, we do 100% for free. And so you were working with a church in Germany, and so thanks for doing that, and thank you to our listeners and our supporters for helping to make that ministry happen.
I would love to be able to tell you that I listened to the episode and knew that you said that, Scott, but right, I haven't picked up on that one yet, but thank you. And yes, it was an awesome trip. So yeah, gosh, so much of what we think about and strategize around and talk about now with churches are international. And so, man, what a fun part of our ministry. It's awesome being in Berlin with a good friend, pastor there, and leading an international church, which is, eventually probably, I don't know. Here you go, Scott. Podcast idea. We're going to talk international church at some point. So cool, so interesting, so unique. And yes, be watching for that one because that's a great topic. But anyway.
Yeah. So I don't want to get sidetracked here, but by international church, we're talking about churches that have like an international like the congregation itself is international. So you're like expats in some other country.
From
gathering together, building some community. Yeah, they're from all over the world, but they're maybe in Germany or they're in France or they're in some other spot. Yeah, it is really cool. We've been building some relationships with folks in that network of churches, and that's really cool. So the topic today is, I guess, one that's close to my heart a little bit. I am a millennial. If our listeners don't know, I'm 36. And so I think sometimes people think millennials are like 18 or something, or 20. They're not. They're all either almost in their 30s or fully in their 30s, even into their 40s. Like that's millennials. They're past college. They're into their life, career, families, all of that. And we have a phenomenon that I think is maybe most accentuated in that age group, in that category, of folks going through something called deconstruction. So this is a term you may have seen online, people deconstructing their faith, or you've seen ex-evangelicals, people who were formerly evangelical and now they're ex-evangelical. And the endpoint for that journey for a lot of folks is different. So some sort of deconstruct their faith, so to speak, all the way to the point of not being involved in church anymore, maybe being an atheist, or just not using the term Christian or something. Others, they just maybe disengage from church entirely. Some reconstruct their faith at some point, kind of come back to church, come back to their faith in some newfound way. But I wanted to explore this phenomenon a little bit. We see it a lot online with like former singers of bands and things like that, or sometimes formerly Christian authors or pastors sometimes. But I wanted to explore this phenomenon a little bit and share a little bit of my own journey, not with deconstructing. I didn't really deconstruct, but just my own faith journey. And through my own experience, I can see why it happens. Like, why does this happen? So I don't know. Maybe it would be easiest if you ask me some questions and I can answer them.
Yeah, I was about to say, we have vastly different experiences in our own faith walk, And so this is not my experience. And so, yeah, if you're not watching this on YouTube, where you can see that I'm older than Scott, I'm a Gen Xer and I'm 50 years old. And, I don't necessarily relate. Before we went on the air, talked about kind of my youth group experience versus Scott's youth group experience. And,
Yeah.
and they're just different. And so, yeah, maybe I'm just going to be kind of like, prompting you through explaining this and asking questions as you mention things. I also want to kind of let's set aside a theological position on this for this piece of time that you're spending with us today, because there are certainly some who believe once a Christian always a Christian, so effectual calling and these kinds of things. Let's set aside what our theological position is on whether you can ever not be a Christian once you are, these kinds of things, to simply more the individual's experience in what their personal beliefs might have been and
Yeah.
where they felt like they were at. And
That's a
where
good point. We're trying to describe the phenomenon.
Yeah.
And I want to end the episode today with I think maybe some practical solutions, things your church can do. But I did want to spend at least the first kind of half of this episode just describing what this is, because I would guess that we have a lot of listeners, AJ, who are sitting in your chair going, well, this was not my experience. I do not understand why this is happening.
Yeah, right.
And I very much do understand why it's happening.
I don't even know how many people are necessarily aware, or how much it's at the forefront of their thoughts and ideas. If you're a church leader and you are really charged with ministering to and discipling people of all age groups, I don't know how much you're aware that this is happening. And maybe it is in varying degrees, depending on where you live, because there is still variation of culture within the United States, depending on geography. Let's start off, Scott. Let's touch back for just real quick, kind of a setup on like youth group in general. I think this is a little bit interesting. So Gen X, I was involved with like junior high school youth group, I was never a major church kid. But I had a little bit of connection with that in the mid to late 80s. Enjoyed my youth pastor. It was we did some fun things. I don't know. I can remember hanging out in a youth room and having some conversations, taking trips to the mall. This was kind of like the extent of my youth group experience. Knew some friends that were a little more involved in Baptist churches. That was a Methodist church I was involved with. That's a whole topic for another day. But my Baptist friends, were a little more active. They were introducing me to a couple of songs. I don't know. I remember hearing "Awesome God" in the late 80s or early 90s. But you, Scott, were you're 10, 15 years behind me, dead center into the 90s, and even my removed awareness of this. We had I think there was a bit of a Christian music revolution happening.
Yeah.
The music was getting a little more contemporary, a little cooler, a little more, catchy. And did that play a role in youth experience in the 90s that helped give kids a sense of belonging and connection, but maybe also perhaps a shallower experience in discipleship?
Yeah. Well, it's that correlation and causation question a little bit. Like, are they correlated? Maybe. I'm not sure that the Christian music boom caused this, but certainly I would contend that and I'm a youth ministry major. I graduated, I have a degree in youth ministry. So as far as youth ministry goes, it had a building momentum from the 60s. Like from the 1960s, you had this growing youth group culture. I really think it hit its zenith. It was like peak youth group subculture, particularly among evangelical type churches, non-denominational Bible churches, Baptist churches, and so on. Hit its stride and hit its peak zenith from like 1990 to 2005. I think that was peak youth group. That doesn't mean that there aren't still big youth group programs today, but they'll tell you, the folks who run youth ministry, they'll tell you, oh, this is not the same as it was 20 years ago. It's just not. It's different. So I think peak youth group subculture was when I was growing up. And a lot of these people who are deconstructing, they were in that same boat. And so, yes, there was like big DC Talk, Newsboys, Audio Adrenaline, Sonic Flood. I mean, you had this rush, and it did give, AJ, to your question, a sense of identity.
Mm-hmm.
Like you were listening to this music. You had that, you had your little portable CD player with skip protection, and you're bringing it in the church van with 20 different CDs, in the, what I'm talking about, like
portfolio
your
thing, yeah.
portfolio, and you've got all of these different Christian CDs, and it did create a subculture that people could identify with that subculture. Does that make sense?
Mm.
So you had people who were engaged in Christian youth group subculture, not necessarily affiliating at their heart level with faith and scripture and theological questions. It was like, I like these people. I like this music. I like this crowd. My parents want me there because it's safer than being a part of some other 90s subculture, skaters or whatever else.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So, okay. So is there a connection here? We talk a lot about mission in the church. We talk about the Great Commission, and we hone in on the discipleship side of maturing disciples and teach them to obey everything that I've commanded you. And, and we talk about gaining knowledge versus real transformation.
Mm-hmm.
The demonstration of a life given to Christ is obeying his commands, and which you can't live out obedience without, that's different behavior. It's different behavior after than it was before. So is there any connection there in more of an emphasis on more knowledge based rather than obedience and transformation?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think that the youth group subculture that I grew up in was hyper focused on two things. Number one, don't have premarital sex.
Okay.
So had this the purity rings, that whole purity movement, I Kiss Dating Goodbye, that whole thing. Like you had this purity movement. So they were really worried about you having sex. They were also they didn't want you to believe in evolution. Like that would be the worst possible thing that could happen. So youth group culture, and I'm being very general here. Yeah, broad brush. But 90s youth group subculture was very concerned about making sure you kept it tight on the relationships, sexuality, purity things, and that you for sure definitely don't engage with evolution at all. And so this is the rise of the Ken Hams, of the world. And I'm not trying to insult Ken Ham, but at all. Joshua McDowell. I mean, Josh McDowell's stuff is almost exclusively about both of those things. Like, right? It's like, please take a very literal reading of Genesis and also keep it in your pants. Like that's all that I just summarized every Joshua McDowell event in the 90s. And that's not an insult to them necessarily. I'm not criticizing their perspective. I'm saying that that's what kids heard. So they thought what a Christian means is I don't believe in evolution and I have a purity ring.
Mm-hmm.
That's their whole construction of Christianity is I like this music, I like these people, I'm saving myself for marriage, and I don't believe in evolution. Okay. Like, where is anything else from Scripture at all in that? Does that make sense?
Yeah, we're really kind of getting into the heart of things here now. I feel like, kind of summarizing this again, super broad. Your experience might have been slightly different, but maybe some of this is resonating with you as Scott is identifying some major components of youth ministry and growing up in that time period in American culture that might have set the stage for life questions later that people were ill-equipped to deal with or answer.
Layer on top of that, this is the zenith also of the Left Behind series.
Okay.
So if there's like a veneer that's like on top of all of that, it's like the rapture could happen tomorrow.
Mm,
You might be left behind. So
mm.
this is then the call then on the evangelism side, so to speak.
Yeah.
Follow Jesus, or you might get left behind.
Fire insurance. Yeah.
Right. So throw that in the mix on the top of all of that. So you have a subculture that's identified through music. You know, you have the core tenets of youth group faith is please make a decision for Christ. You're not left behind. Don't have sex and avoid evolution at all costs. Like this is the whole sum total of what faith looks like.
This is actually really fascinating to consider these things. I've never sat and just thought about. I mean, I'm aware of these things, but it wasn't my experience, so I've never really put these pieces together to build a puzzle different than my own.
I want to be generous to the leaders and the people who are in this. These are likely not their core motivations, right?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
But when you're 13 and these are the loudest voices you're hearing, it's informing what your faith perspective is.
Yeah.
That's the loudest messages you're hearing when you're 13. And you don't have the brain development to be able to contextualize, well, why does purity matter?
Yeah, right.
Why is God being the creator matter? And I mean, I would push back and say, like, why did we ordain a fiction series by Tim LaHaye and Jerry Jenkins
LaHaye, yeah.
As like, this is it was like an authoritative book,
Yeah.
So I actually would criticize the popularity that gained.
The Bible's not clear on some of this, so read this 12-part series to get
read this fiction series. It'll fill in the gaps for you. Yeah. I'm not criticizing people who have that perspective. I'm just saying it took on a level of authority in people's lives that I think was not substantiated.
Hey, I was not mature enough. I read the whole series. I was not mature enough. It was super interesting for me. It actually led me just to question. I questioned a lot of things and started coming up with better answers. I actually loved the Left Behind series.
But you weren't 13.
That's right. I wasn't 13. I was, 28 years old. And
it's a big difference.
Sure. It helped form my eschatology through that point in my life. But I've learned a lot of new perspectives since then. But okay, but yeah, we don't need to.
This isn't a bashing of Left Behind.
It was a fun read, I thought. So
yeah.
But anyway, yeah,
it was more like a horror story when you're 12. Planes are crashing.
Shout out to Kirk Cameron though for bringing that to life. Thanks, buddy. Okay, well, gosh, all right. So we're beginning to see a bit of a lens on what the problem may have been through some of that. Any other pieces to that, Scott?
Okay. So then what you have is a pipeline then from you graduate from high school. Now I need to recapture that youth group experience in some other environment, right? So this is where Crew comes in, Campus Crusade for Christ. Maybe it's depending on your denominational background, maybe you've got some sort of denominational college ministry type thing. For me personally, I went to a Christian college, and so I'm getting not Bible college. It was a liberal arts school that had a historically Christian background, so there were enough Christian organizations kind of on campus. So you're able to sort of recreate that atmosphere. It's a little bit different.
Yeah. So tell us more about that atmosphere. What was that atmosphere like? Was it? Because it seems to me, I would have expected, okay, we're a little bit older now. We're going to get a little more into the word. We're going to, gain some depth with one another in this shared life experience. Is that not what the case was?
Yeah, no, I think to some degree that does happen. And that's why some kids then start deconstructing or walking away from faith entirely at that point, because they're like asking questions. But you can, if you want to, keep the bubble, right? If I get involved enough Christian
Yeah.
I can insulate myself from having to ask too hard of questions.
Okay.
Right? Like I can create a friend group that all thinks mostly like I do. And yes, maybe I'm exploring things at a slightly deeper level now than I did certainly when I was 13, but I'm still more or less insulated, and I still feel more or less like I'm in a Christian culture here. So I'm never pushing the boundaries too much. I'm not too isolated. I'm not going too far outside the boundary lines, so to speak.
Yeah.
More or less still insulated from those kinds of things. And they liked the same music that I did. And they have a purity ring too.
Okay. So at some point though, people grow up, we mature, we get out of college, we start families, we have careers, we've got the pressures of life raining down on us from a variety of angles. And I mean, is this kind of where we're at in the conversation? Like stuff starts happening and you need to be able to lean on something. You got to have answers for tough questions in life. And you fall back on the training that you've had, just like in any experience, military, police, doctors, they fall back on their training when the pressure gets put on them. And when people in the millennial generation fell back on their training, their life training, they were finding gaps in
woefully insufficient.
Okay.
Yeah. So life smacks. It happens to everyone eventually.
Yeah.
For me, it happened in 2015. I was at that point, I guess 30 something, 30. And I'm leaving, had a kind of a tough leaving from a job. So I graduate from college and I go straight into working in ministry. So I'm like continuing this bubble I've created for myself. It's now at 2015, I'm leaving this church. It's before I've really started working with Malphurs group. And even what I do now with the Malphurs group, like it's something that I'm choosing to engage in. It's a different level versus when you're on staff at a church. So I'm leaving, and now for the very first time in my life, no one's expecting me to be at church. My parents aren't expecting me to. It's not part of my job. Like it's up to me and my wife to decide, are we going to engage in church or are we not? And I had all kinds of church hurt, really personal failings of my own, relationships that are damaged and painful and very difficult. This is the biggest crisis I've experienced on an emotional level. And I very much, AJ, felt the stresses of all of that on my soul. Like it pushed the bounds of what I knew about faith. Now, I had at this point engaged in things a lot more than maybe some other people had. Certainly having been on staff in church, hopefully, I'm like reading scripture and exploring these concepts on a much more deeper, nuanced level, right? But if you've not gone through all that, AJ, and so you've maintained this bubble, and the majority of it's still built on like purity culture and, very particular view on eschatology, very particular view on science and the Bible. And that's the whole construct of your faith. Then you get smacked in the face with reality in real life. That is not a flexible thing. And it can't withstand a whole lot of pressure. It's very easy for it to collapse. So you start asking deeper questions about faith, deeper questions about scripture and about God that you should have asked when you were 12, but no one ever made you.
You wouldn't have known to ask that. Yeah. You would not have known.
I would contend that the most people who are deconstructing their faith, they're not even asking the most interesting questions. They're asking questions that have good answers. Questions about the problem of evil. Questions about how can we know that God is real and that God exists. And so these kinds of deeper questions. Yeah. And it's why I'd point to Rob Bell and the book Velvet Elvis. This is a book that really resonated with people in my generation because he talks about this. He talks about having a degree of faith that has, he compared it to like a trampoline. It should have some flex to it. And he was pointing out rightly at the time that there are a lot of people, a lot of Christians whose faith has no ability for them to be able to bounce through the challenges of life, that it has no flex in it. It was so rigid and it was so thin that the least bit of pressure caused it to snap. He was right about that. He was wrong about a zillion other things, but he was correct about that. And it's why that book resonated with so many people, especially in my age category, because people were going, yeah, my faith is flimsy and not built on much.
Yeah. I mean, it's really driving home the importance of building in, I guess, a bit of a questioning culture to some extent with our younger people in the church, but exposing them to deeper ideas in the faith, a little bit deeper doctrine, so that they've got at least a familiarity, an awareness of
exposing them to doubt.
Yeah.
Jesus has no problem at all with Thomas being like, is that really you? And he's like, yeah, it's me. Come put your hand. Yeah. And 90s youth group subculture was, don't ask that question. Of course it's him.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, look, he just appeared in the room. Why do you need more evidence? Look at the other evidence. But Jesus' answer to Thomas, when you think about it, was, come closer to me. Come close enough to me to touch me. Yeah. And you'll know. Forget about the fact that I just appeared in this room and nobody knows how I got here and you thought I was dead. Just come closer. Yeah. And you'll get the, so, wow, dude.
Yeah. Or mind. Peter's doubts are about himself because of his own, he knows his own sin and failure. And it's the same. Jesus says, let's have breakfast. So, versus get over yourself or whatever. And I will be honest with you, I carry with me still all of that. Like, I'm still sorting through all of that junk. And it's no one's fault. I'm not blaming my church. I'm not blaming my parents. I'm not blaming any one aspect of this. It's just, it's the water was swimming in, and you have to deal with that stuff.
It was a season of, the capital C church, not 100%, but for a lot of people's experience, it was a season that the church went through in the United States, at least. That, hey, this is the reality, and we just need to talk about it, be aware of it, and be able to combat it now on the back end as much as we can to the best ability that we have as leaders in the church. I mean, this is the Church Revitalization Podcast. We talk about practical, actionable ideas to help the church be better equipped to serve the body and make disciples of Jesus. And so, this is just a little kind of niche thing that we wanted to get into today. So let's shift over to talking about what should we be doing as leaders in the church now.
So, let's land this plane. I think it's worth noting that what you have then is you have a generation, and it is very niche. Like, you're talking about kids from the 90s and early 2000s who grew up in a particular subculture and had a particular experience. But in terms of people who are going to your church, that's a disproportionate percentage of people, right? Like, so as the population of the United States, that's maybe, a relatively small subgroup. But in terms of people who should be going to your church, it's an outsized percentage of people, disproportionate. And you have to recognize that they are sorting through what was even real about my experience. They're asking the question, was I involved in this just because I liked the music? Because this girl that I liked, she was going, so I was going to. Like, they're sorting through all those questions too. And they're asking for the very first time questions about, how can I know God is real? How can I what do I do when God says he loves me, but my life is crap right now? and really hard. You say this, but I'm experiencing this. How can I trust this? What do I do when I read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and seemingly I'm reading the same stories, but the details are different? The world tells me that means the Bible's unreliable. What is it? How can I know Scripture's reliable? Like all of these things that have good answers, you have people in their 30s who don't know these answers.
Yeah. And, coupled with that, with, modern culture and social media and the term influencer, there are younger people making really bad life decisions all the time because of someone that they look up to on some level is making the same decision for their own life. And so we've got, some people in a position of influence, millennials in a position of influence now that could be having an effect on the Gen Zs or whatever in the world comes after them. I don't know what they're called, but
yeah, I could make the argument, AJ, that for you, even as Gen X, there was some sort of cultural reward for you getting your life together and showing up at church, as when you were in your 30s. Like there was some sort of cultural, like, oh, he's becoming an upstanding citizen, he's involved in his church and whatever.
Yeah.
Right. The incentive structure is not the same. Now there is cultural incentive for you to keep walking away from your faith.
Right. Yeah.
It's brave. That's brave for you to walk away from that. So
post-Christian.
You have a very online group who will cheer you on in your walk away from faith, which makes it extra difficult to sort through these questions and disincentivizes you from even getting the answers to them.
Yeah, that's right.
So that's compounding the problem. Sorry. Okay. We were going to get into solutions.
So culturally, it's harder to be anchored into something true in the Christian faith culturally than it used to be. It's easier now to be anchored in something post-Christian, anti-Christian.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So let me give some maybe potential solutions.
Okay.
Number one, you need to not have a competency bias when it comes to these deeper questions. Not just think, oh, he or she, they grew up in church, they should know the answer to these questions. Maybe assume that they don't know the answer to those questions.
Yeah.
And anticipate them. I would really recommend looking at the Alpha course. If you're going, I don't even know how I would help people answer these questions. The Alpha course is a course designed for people who have doubts about faith. And they have a very good rate. It's like 80% of people who come with no faith and take the Alpha course come out with faith. 80%. It's really good. So if you're like, I need something that's plug and play, that's pretty simple, that helps me answer these questions, look at Alpha. It may not be perfect and it may not be a fit for you, but you should check it out and at least see what it's doing. And maybe you can borrow from some of what they're doing for what makes sense in your context.
Yeah.
But you need to be anticipating those questions. Don't assume that people know the answers, and just assume that you've got a lot of people in my age category, sort of in their 30s and 40s, who might be showing up at your church, but we're carrying a lot of doubts, faith doubts with us. Secondly, don't be ambiguous on things. Like, be clear. I think that the political environment is such that we want to be ambiguous and like, I don't want to offend the right. I don't want to offend the left. I'm not asking you to be a conservative or a liberal. I'm asking you to just teach Scripture. So where Scripture is clear on things, just teach that.
Yeah.
And be solid on it. Don't be wishy. Don't squish on Scripture. And then on things that don't have a clear biblical answer, you don't need to then just be like, that doesn't really matter. We don't have a position on that.
Yeah. Or just present a couple of different thoughts on it. I mean, that's okay too. The non-issue things people can maybe make their own decisions on, as long as you also let them know your decision on this doesn't need to be one that you then all of a sudden are like trying to exclude others, or have that
Yeah.
same open-handedness with it. Yeah.
So let me give a specific example because I feel like I want to be sure that I'm being clear. The biggest issue on this is sexuality.
Yeah.
So have a perspective, a biblical point of view, and make the case. So it's a nice thing to say, hate the sin, love the sinner. Okay, that's not good enough. Show me why a biblical sexual ethic is important. So I know that this is directly confronting then people going, I have all these bad memories from the purity culture, and now all you're trying to do is just perpetuate even longer the true love waits. No. I do think that those were really weak. They were making a cultural case for it. They were not making a scriptural case for why the biblical sexual ethic is so important and how it's fundamental to our understanding of who God is and how he's designed families to work. So have a perspective and make the case. And sure, we can say, I don't care what baggage you're carrying in, what bad choices you've made. I don't care what mistakes you've made. I don't care what your instincts are. You're welcome here. But this is how we read scripture. This is what scripture says. And we're going to do everything we can to show you why this matters.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't like when people say hate the sin, love the sinner, because it's just so shallow. It isn't that we hate the sin. Like, it's not about a feeling of hate for the sin, AJ. It's about, this is good for you. The biblical sexual ethic is the pathway to your flourishing. Let me explain why.
Mm-hmm.
That is a very different thing versus hate the sin, love the sinner.
Yeah.
I don't care who you are. You're welcome here. I don't care what mistakes you've made. I don't care where you're at. But I want to share with you the compelling picture of what a vision for a flourishing sexual ethic can be.
Yeah.
Do you see the difference in that?
Mm-hmm.
And we have to do that. I think that it's pushing, we think, well, if we can be a little ambiguous and we can use all of the nice turns of phrase, that's going to attract millennials back to the church. It's not. They want you to be clear. They may not always agree with you. They may be like all in on pride or whatever. Fine. But at least make a case. Make the biblical case. Don't squish. Don't be weird and unclear.
Yeah, that's right. Yep. Okay. That's good.
The last thing that maybe, I think another thing that's really pushed millennials away is how the church has dealt with sin in leadership.
Mm-hmm.
So the perception is church is really good at isolating and alienating church members when they slip up. Oh, this person came out as gay. We're going to kick them out of the church. This person got pregnant. We're going to kick them out of the church. This person had an affair. We're going to kick them out of the church. But when the leaders mess up, we protect them. We don't tell the truth, or we have them quietly go so we don't have to make a big scene. And that to them, it not just looks like hypocrisy. It is hypocrisy. So I think that if you have people who are leaving, if you have leaders that sin, I'm not saying you have to explain every detail in front of the congregation, but you need to be honest about what happened. And hold them accountable. Don't quietly, wisp them away. God is leading them somewhere else with a nice severance package and so tell the truth.
Yeah.
Tell the truth. Have integrity. And that's very, very, very important. I know that sounds basic, but it happens a lot. The churches just quietly dismiss leaders who sin. I think the intention is good. You're trying not to make a scene or whatever, or there may be certain groups of people you're trying to protect, maybe a victim or something like that. So the intentions may be right, but it comes off as trying to protect a predator or, something like that. And it's not good.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well then, I mean, I guess kind of maybe one of the big takeaways, if you really want to boil this down, is your church needs to be honest about what it really believes. It needs to go deep in its teaching, its discipleship of people. It needs to confront culture with biblical standards, and it needs to encourage people to be serious in their faith. I mean, it's very real. This isn't playtime. So, I mean, we need to have churches that are equipped to live that way.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
No, I think the question is, could we have had all of that you were just talking about and had audio adrenaline and DC talk and the Newsboys and sort of the
we could
revolution? Of course we could have.
It would have been awesome.
It would have been great.
Yeah.
It would have been awesome. So it's I think there are some people who might go, well, see, I always knew that contemporary music was bad news.
No.
That was not the problem.
Yeah. It's unfortunate that they intersected at a point in history with perhaps a little bit of shallow church culture, because you know what, that was a great thing to get kids excited about church and being together and doing stuff, and learning more. But we may have just passed through a season in which didn't take advantage of something cool that was happening out in the culture that we could have capitalized on to grow some really solid, deep Christians, to raise up another generation. And now we are fully post-Christian, and our Gen Zs and whatever other things are coming after them aren't growing up now in a space where it's really even a strong possibility that they'll be churched at all from birth on. So
yeah. I want to end this way. I just want to say, finally, be patient with people. Sometimes some people find themselves in this crisis of faith, and only to find themselves drawn back to God at a later time. So don't write anybody off. If you had seen me at my worst in 2015, you might have been like, man, is this a guy, is he going to go back to ministry at all? Is he even going to want to go back to a church? I mean, like I left in September. We didn't go to church till December. I mean, there were months where we were just so wounded that I genuinely questioned him, like, what's next? So anyone could have given up on me in that season. And I would just say, don't do that. Don't give up. Don't give up on people. In the meantime, you be consistent. You tell the truth. You be kind. You be loving and generous. Be that shining city on the hill. You be that stable force. And if you'll do that faithfully, God is ultimately responsible. No matter what your theology is on once saved, always saved, this, that, and the other, God is the one who's responsible for saving souls, not us. Mm-hmm. So we do our job and we let God do his. And I believe that this is not a lost generation. Deconstruction is not the end of the story.
No.
But it's the middle of it that we are in right now. So I believe that you as a church can stand in the gap for people in my generation who are experiencing this season. And be willing to engage in it. And I think it'll pay off.
That's cool. Hey, man, thanks.
This is a weird episode, right?
Yeah, it is kind of weird. Hey, so what? It's different. We've done 152 of these now, folks. So you can go to malphursgroup.com/152 to read the notes from today's episode. Super thankful, Scott, for you, for your ministry, for your transparency and honesty in this, and for even bringing this topic to the table for us to have a look at deconstructing deconstruction. So I hope it was meaningful in some way in your ministry today as well. And again, the call to have biblically healthy churches that are discipling people to the greatest depths so that they become disciple makers is what we're all about. So it's why it's a valuable topic for us to talk about with you today. So thanks for being with us. And we mentioned at the top of the show, we're trying to raise up churches that live out, this solid faith all over the world. So go over to malphursgroup.com/donate to look at how you as an individual or a church through your missions giving could partner with us to be able to continue developing resources and making these trips where we're hands-on with folks, training and teaching and working through the details to help their church make more disciples of Jesus wherever they are in the world. So we're glad you're with us, and we'll be back again with you next week. Thanks.